The millionaire CEO laughed. "If she plays piano, I'll marry her." But when the 22-year-old waitress touched the keys, the entire restaurant froze in disbelief. Follow our channel and hit the like button to support these emotional stories. Your engagement helps us bring more touching moments to life. Now let's dive in. The crystal chandeliers of Le Bernardin cast golden shadows across the marble floors as Alexander Sterling adjusted his Armani suit and surveyed the elegant dining room with the practiced eye of someone who owned half of Manhattan's most exclusive establishments. At 34, he commanded boardrooms with the same ruthless precision he used to dissect a perfectly prepared Dover sole. His dark hair was styled to perfection, his steel-grey eyes calculating every detail of the room, from the imported Italian tablecloths to the worth of each patron's jewelry. "Another champagne, Mr. Sterling?" The sommelier approached with reverent deference, recognizing one of New York's most formidable business titans. Alexander nodded curtly, his attention already shifting to the quarterly reports displayed on his phone screen. Sterling Industries had just closed a $3 billion merger, yet here he sat, obligated to attend his business partner's anniversary dinner when he could be strategizing their next acquisition. "Alexander, you're being antisocial again," chided Victoria Ashworth, sliding into the chair beside him. Her red Valentino dress probably cost more than most people's cars, and her smile held the calculated warmth of someone who'd been raised in Manhattan's social elite. "This is supposed to be a celebration." "I celebrate by making money, Victoria. This," he gestured around the opulent restaurant, "is a waste of time that could be better spent preparing for the Hartwell acquisition." Victoria laughed, a sound like expensive wind chimes. "You know what your problem is. You've forgotten how to have fun. When was the last time you did something spontaneous?" Before Alexander could respond with his usual cutting remark about spontaneity being the enemy of success, a young woman appeared at their table. She moved with quiet grace despite carrying a heavily loaded tray, her long auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that somehow made her green eyes more striking. The black uniform of the restaurant's waitstaff couldn't disguise her natural elegance, though Alexander barely glanced up from his phone. "Good evening. I'm Emma, and I'll be taking care of your table tonight," she said, her voice carrying a slight rasp that suggested exhaustion. "Can I start you with any appetizers?" Victoria ordered, with the casual extravagance of someone who'd never checked a price, while Alexander continued scrolling through emails. When Emma turned to him expectantly, he finally looked up, and for a moment something flickered in his expression, a recognition of intelligence in her eyes that seemed out of place for a waitress in even the finest establishment. "The usual," he said dismissively, returning to his phone. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't know what your usual order is. This is my first evening serving your section." The slight sharpness in her tone made Alexander look up again, this time with the focused attention he usually reserved for boardroom adversaries. There was something in the way she held herself, a dignity that refused to be diminished by his condescension. "Oysters Rockefeller, the Wagyu beef, medium rare and whatever wine pairs best," he said, his voice carrying the impatience of someone unaccustomed to repeating himself. "Excellent choice." "The 2015 Bordeaux would complement the Wagyu beautifully," Emma replied, and Alexander caught the subtle note of knowledge in her recommendation, knowledge that went beyond standard server training. As she walked away, Victoria leaned closer. "She's pretty." "She's the help," Alexander replied, though his eyes followed Emma's retreating figure longer than he cared to admit. The evening progressed with typical Manhattan social theater, discussions of real estate prices, complaints about the mayor's policies, and gossip about which socialite was divorcing which hedge fund prince. Alexander participated with half his attention, while the other half remained fixed on quarterly projections, until Victoria suddenly grabbed his arm. "Oh my God, Alexander, look!" She pointed toward the restaurant's grand piano, where the evening's scheduled pianist, a distinguished older gentleman, was being helped to a chair by concerned staff members. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced the maitre d', his French accent thick with concern, "I'm afraid Monsieur Dubois has taken ill and will be unable to perform this evening. We sincerely apologize for any disappointment." A murmur of disappointment rippled through the dining room. The piano was a centerpiece of Le Bernardin's ambiance, its nightly performances as essential as the expertly prepared cuisine. Alexander saw an opportunity for entertainment in the disruption. The champagne had loosened his tongue, and Victoria's earlier comment about spontaneity had touched a nerve. He stood commanding attention with the natural authority that came from owning buildings taller than most people's ambitions. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried easily across the restaurant, "I have a proposition that might salvage our evening's entertainment." All eyes turned to him, including Emma's, who had been clearing a nearby table. Alexander's gaze found hers and held it, a predatory smile spreading across his handsome features. "I'll bet anyone in this room that our charming waitress here," he gestured toward Emma, who had gone completely still, "can't play a single piece on that piano with any degree of competence. In fact, I'm so confident in this assessment that I'll make an outrageous wager." The restaurant had fallen completely silent, the kind of silence that precedes either triumph or disaster. Emma's face had gone pale, but her green eyes blazed with something that might have been fury or determination. "What kind of wager, Mr. Sterling?" The use of his name surprised him. She'd been listening, learning, cataloging information like any good intelligence gatherer. "Interesting. If you can play any classical piece with the skill of a trained musician, really play, not just stumble through chopsticks, I'll marry you." The words came out before his rational mind could stop them, fueled by champagne and the absolute certainty that a waitress couldn't possibly possess such skills. Victoria gasped. "Alexander, you can't be serious." "Dead serious," he replied, his eyes never leaving Emma's face. "Of course, when you inevitably fail, you'll quit this job tonight and never work in any establishment I frequent again. Fair enough?" The cruelty of the wager wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Alexander Sterling could destroy a service worker's career in Manhattan with a single phone call, and everyone knew it. This wasn't just a bet, it was a public humiliation designed to amuse a bored billionaire. Emma stood perfectly still for a long moment, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet strength that made Alexander's smug confidence waver almost imperceptibly. "And if I win, you'll honor your word? You'll actually marry me?" "I'm a man of my word in business," Alexander replied, though something in Emma's tone made him suddenly wish he'd ordered another bottle of wine instead of making foolish bets. Emma walked toward the piano with measured steps, her posture straightening with each stride. As she passed tables of Manhattan's elite, whispers followed in her wake. Some diners had their phones out, recording what they assumed would be either spectacular failure or social media gold. She sat at the bench, her fingers hovering over the keys for a moment that stretched into eternity. When she finally placed her hands on the keyboard, something extraordinary happened. The opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the restaurant with crystalline perfection, not the simple melody, but the full, complex arrangement that required years of classical training to master. Emma's fingers moved across the keys with fluid precision, her entire body swaying with the music, as if she and the piano were old lovers reunited after a long separation. The technical difficulty of the piece was staggering: rapid scales, complex harmonies, and emotional passages that required not just skill but deep musical understanding. Emma played it flawlessly, her face transformed by concentration and something deeper, something that looked like pain being channeled into beauty. Alexander's smug smile had vanished completely. His champagne glass hung forgotten in his hand as he watched this waitress, this woman he'd dismissed as the help, perform with the skill of a conservatory graduate. Around the restaurant, conversations had stopped entirely. Even the kitchen staff had emerged to listen. When Emma reached the concerto's most technically challenging passage, a section that separated amateur pianists from true artists, she didn't just survive it, she soared. Her left hand maintained the complex bass line, while her right hand danced through intricate melodies with a precision that would have impressed Carnegie Hall audiences. The final notes lingered in the air like a blessing, and for several heartbeats no one moved. Then applause erupted, genuine and thunderous, from every corner of the restaurant. Several women were crying, and even the hardened maitre d' was wiping his eyes. Emma stood slowly, her hands shaking now from more than just nerves. She looked directly at Alexander, and in her eyes he saw something that made his chest tight. Not triumph, but a profound sadness, mixed with steely determination. "I believe you owe me a wedding, Mr. Sterling." Alexander Sterling had built his empire by never showing weakness. But as he stared at Emma across the now silent restaurant, he felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood. Complete uncertainty. The woman standing by the piano wasn't the simple waitress he'd mockingly challenged. The skill she'd just demonstrated represented years of elite musical training, the kind that cost more than most people's annual salaries. "That was," Victoria whispered beside him, but her words trailed off as she processed the implications of what they'd all witnessed. Alexander's business instincts kicked in, searching for an escape clause, a technicality that could void his impulsive wager. But he'd made the bet publicly, in front of Manhattan's social elite, many of whom were already recording the aftermath on their phones. His reputation for being a man of his word in business deals was the foundation of his success. He couldn't simply walk away from this without destroying his credibility. Emma began walking back toward their table, her movements controlled but graceful. As she approached, Alexander noticed details he'd missed before. The way she carried herself with natural poise despite wearing a server's uniform, the intelligence in her green eyes that suggested depths he hadn't bothered to explore, and something else, a wariness that spoke of experience with disappointment. "Well," she said quietly when she reached his table, "are you a man of your word, or just another rich man who thinks promises are for other people?" The challenge in her voice sparked something competitive in Alexander's nature. He stood, matching her height in her comfortable flats to his expensive Italian shoes. "I made a public wager, and you fulfilled your end admirably. But surely you don't expect me to actually marry someone I've known for all of 30 minutes. I expect you to honor your commitment, Mr. Sterling. You made the terms quite clear. If I could play classical music with the skill of a trained musician, you'd marry me." "I held up my end of the bargain," Victoria gasped. "Emma, you can't be serious. You don't actually want to marry him." Emma's smile held no warmth. "Oh, but I am serious. Deadly serious." Alexander studied her face, looking for signs of gold-digger desperation or social climbing ambition. Instead, he found something far more complex. Determination mixed with what looked suspiciously like hurt pride and carefully controlled anger. "You're calling in the debt?" he asked, his voice dropping to the low tone he used in hostile business negotiations. "I'm collecting on a promise. There's a difference." The surrounding diners were still watching, phones still recording, social media posts already being crafted about the most outrageous bet in Manhattan's social history. Alexander realized he was trapped by his own arrogance and the very public nature of his foolish wager. "Fine," he said, his jaw tight, "but we'll do this properly. A real engagement, a proper wedding. If I'm going to honor this ridiculous bet, we'll do it right." Emma's composure flickered for just a moment, as if she hadn't expected him to actually agree. "How properly?" 6 months engagement minimum. You'll move into my penthouse. We'll attend social functions together. And you'll learn what it means to be married to someone in my position. If after 6 months you still want to go through with this insanity, we'll have a wedding that won't embarrass either of us. And if I change my mind during those 6 months, Alexander's smile was sharp, then you walk away with nothing, having proven that this was just an elaborate gold-digger scheme. The insult hit its mark. Emma's cheeks flushed with anger. "I'm not a gold-digger, Mr. Sterling. I'm a woman who believes people should keep their promises." "We'll see," he replied coolly. Then louder for the benefit of their audience, "Ladies and gentlemen, it appears I'm engaged." The restaurant erupted in surprised chatter and congratulations that ranged from genuine to clearly fake. Victoria looked stunned, while Emma appeared to be questioning her own sanity. As the evening wound down and other diners began to leave, many stopping to congratulate the unlikely couple, Alexander found himself alone with Emma by the piano. The restaurant staff was giving them space, though he caught them whispering and stealing glances. "So," he said, adjusting his cufflinks in a gesture that betrayed his nervousness, "I suppose we should discuss practical arrangements. Do you have somewhere to live currently?" "A small apartment in Queens," Emma replied, her voice careful and neutral. "You'll need to give notice immediately." I'll have my assistant arrange for your belongings to be moved to my penthouse. We'll need to shop for appropriate clothing. My fiancé can't be seen in." He gestured vaguely at her server's uniform. Emma's eyes flashed dangerously. "There's nothing wrong with honest work, Mr. Sterling. And there's nothing wrong with my clothes outside of this uniform." "Of course not," he said quickly, recognizing he'd stumbled into dangerous territory. "I simply meant that as my fiancé, you'll be attending events that have certain expectations about attire. Designer gowns and jewelry worth more than some people's houses?" "Exactly." Emma was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. "Can I ask you something?" "What? Why did you make that bet? Really? Was it just cruelty for entertainment, or was there something else?" The question caught Alexander off guard with its directness. He found himself actually considering it seriously, instead of deflecting with his usual sarcasm. "Honestly, you intrigued me," he admitted. "There was something about the way you carried yourself, the way you recommended that wine. You didn't seem like just a waitress, but I couldn't figure out what you were hiding. The bet was crude curiosity, I suppose." "And what do you think now that you know I can play piano?" Alexander looked at her carefully. "Now I think you're hiding much more than I initially suspected. The question is whether that makes you more interesting or more dangerous." Emma's laugh held no humor. "I suppose you'll find out during our 6-month engagement, won't you?" "I suppose I will." He paused, then asked, "Where did you learn to play like that? That wasn't amateur hour talent." For the first time since the bet began, Emma's composure cracked slightly. Pain flashed across her features before she controlled it. "That's a story for another day, Mr. Sterling." "Alexander," he corrected automatically. "If we're going to be engaged, you should use my first name." "Alexander," she repeated, and something about the way she said it made his name sound different, more personal. "And you should know I'm not doing this for your money. I have my own reasons for accepting this arrangement." "What reasons?" Emma gathered her purse and the light jacket she'd worn to work. "Like I said, that's a story for another day. But Alexander, you might want to have your assistant research the name Emma Blackwood before I move into your penthouse." She walked away, leaving Alexander standing by the piano with the distinct feeling that he'd just agreed to far more than a simple business arrangement. The name Blackwood tickled something in his memory, but he couldn't quite place it. As he watched Emma disappear into the Manhattan night, Alexander Sterling, who had never met a challenge he couldn't conquer or a problem he couldn't solve with money, realized he might have finally bitten off more than he could chew, and for the first time in years he found himself genuinely curious about what tomorrow would bring. Alexander's penthouse occupied the entire top floor of Sterling Tower, a testament to both his success and his need to remain above the city he'd conquered. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Manhattan, while the interior design spoke of refined taste and unlimited budgets. As he waited for Emma to arrive with her belongings, he found himself unusually restless. His assistant, Margaret Chen, had delivered the research he'd requested on Emma Blackwood with her typical efficiency, but the file she'd placed on his mahogany desk remained unopened. Some instinct told him he should hear Emma's story from her own lips, rather than read it in a cold investigative report. The elevator chimed, and Emma stepped into his private foyer, carrying 2 modest suitcases and a worn leather messenger bag. She'd traded her server's uniform for dark jeans and a cream silk blouse that suggested she owned better clothes than he'd assumed. Her auburn hair fell loose around her shoulders, and without the harsh restaurant lighting, he could see that she was even more beautiful than he'd initially realized. "Impressive," she said, looking around the space with an appraising eye that suggested familiarity with luxury, rather than awe at experiencing it for the first time. "You don't seem surprised by the accommodations," Alexander observed. "I'm not," Emma replied simply, setting down her luggage. "I've seen places like this before." Another puzzle piece that didn't quite fit the waitress narrative. Alexander filed the information away and gestured toward the hallway. "The guest suite is down the hall. You'll have your own bathroom, walk-in closet, and sitting area, complete privacy." Emma nodded. "And what exactly do you expect from me during these 6 months?" "Public appearances as my fiancé. Social events, business dinners, charity galas. You'll need to be convincing in the role, My reputation depends on this looking legitimate. And privately? Alexander met her gaze directly. Privately, we're strangers who made a foolish bet. I won't pretend this is some romantic fairy tale, and I assume you're too intelligent to expect one. Emma's smile was enigmatic. You assume a great deal about what I expect, Alexander. She moved to the window, looking out over the city with an expression he couldn't read. In profile, with the afternoon light catching her features, she looked almost aristocratic, the kind of bone structure that suggested generations of breeding and privilege. "Can I ask you something?" she said without turning around. "What? Do you remember the Blackwood Industries collapse 8 years ago?" The name hit Alexander like a physical blow. Suddenly he knew exactly why Blackwood had seemed familiar. The scandal had been front-page news for months, a family empire built over 4 generations, destroyed overnight by embezzlement charges and fraudulent accounting. The family had lost everything: their fortune, their social standing, their reputation. "You're not," he began, but Emma turned to face him, and her expression confirmed his suspicion. Emma Blackwood, former heiress to a $2 billion fortune, former member of New York's social elite, former student at Juilliard, where I was studying piano performance before my world imploded. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the pain underneath. Current waitress, former cleaning lady, former nanny, former whatever job I could get to survive. Alexander stared at her, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. "Your father was Jonathan Blackwood, the embezzlement scandal." "My father was framed," Emma said quietly, "by his business partner and best friend, who needed a scapegoat when their offshore accounts were discovered by federal investigators. But by the time the truth came out, Dad was already dead from a heart attack brought on by the stress and humiliation. The family name was destroyed, the money was gone, and I was 22 years old with a music degree and no practical skills for survival in the real world." The raw honesty in her voice made Alexander feel something unfamiliar, shame at his earlier dismissiveness, and something deeper that might have been respect. "Why didn't you tell me this at the restaurant?" Emma laughed bitterly. "And what would you have done? Probably offered me money out of pity and rescinded your bet." "I didn't want your charity, Alexander. I wanted your pride to cost you something, the way it cost my family everything." "So this is revenge." "This is justice," Emma corrected. "You made a bet designed to humiliate someone you saw as beneath you. Instead, you're going to learn what it's like to be bound by a commitment you can't buy your way out of." Alexander walked to his bar and poured himself a scotch, his mind racing. Emma Blackwood, he remembered her now from society pages, back when she'd been a promising young pianist and a fixture at Manhattan charity events. The transformation from privileged socialite to service worker must have been devastating. "The piano skills," he said, understanding flooding through him. 12 years of training at the finest conservatories money could buy. I was scheduled to perform with the New York Philharmonic the month after my world collapsed. Instead, I spent that month learning how to clean office buildings for minimum wage." Alexander downed his scotch, the burn helping him process this revelation. "Why take the bet, Emma? You could have just let me make a fool of myself and walked away." Emma moved closer, and he could smell her perfume, something subtle and expensive that suggested old money rather than new wealth. "Because I've spent 8 years being invisible, being dismissed, being treated as less than human by people who used to bow and scrape for my family's approval. Last night you looked at me the way they all do, as if I was nothing, and I realized I was tired of being nothing. So you decided to become my fiancé. I decided to remind a certain arrogant CEO that actions have consequences, even for men who think they're untouchable." Alexander found himself oddly impressed by her strategic thinking. "And what happens in 6 months when this engagement is supposed to end? What's your exit strategy?" Emma's smile was mysterious. "Who says I have one?" The implications of that statement hung in the air between them. Alexander studied her face, looking for signs of gold-digger opportunism, but instead found something more complex: intelligence, determination, and what might have been genuine attraction beneath the calculated strategy. "You're playing a dangerous game, Emma Blackwood. I learned from the best, she replied. 8 years in the service industry teaches you how to read people, how to anticipate their moves, how to survive in a world that wants to crush you. You may have built an empire, Alexander, but I've learned how to rise from the ashes of one. Alexander set down his empty glass, his business instincts warring with something else, and growing fascination with this woman who had turned his simple, cruel bet into something far more complex. "All right," he said finally. 6 months. But Emma, if you think you can play me the way those society vultures played your father, you're going to be disappointed. I didn't build Sterling Industries by being naive about people's motivations. Emma's laugh was genuinely amused this time. "Oh, Alexander, if you think this is about money, you really don't understand what game we're playing." As she picked up her luggage and headed toward the guest suite, Alexander found himself watching her with new eyes. Emma Blackwood wasn't just beautiful or talented or mysterious. She was dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with physical threat, and everything to do with the growing certainty that his carefully controlled life was about to become very, very complicated. And despite every rational instinct screaming warnings, he found himself looking forward to finding out exactly how complicated things were about to become. 3 weeks into their engagement, Alexander Sterling discovered that living with Emma Blackwood was like trying to contain lightning in a bottle. She moved through his penthouse with the unconscious grace of someone born to luxury, yet her sharp observations about his business dealings revealed an intelligence that constantly surprised him. What disturbed him most was how naturally she fit into his world, and how much he'd begun to look forward to their evening conversations over dinner. That illusion of harmony shattered on a cold Tuesday morning when Margaret Chen knocked on his office door with an expression that meant trouble. "Sir, there's a situation developing. Richard Hartwell is here with his legal team, and they're demanding an immediate meeting. They seem agitated." Alexander looked up from the merger documents spread across his desk. The Hartwell acquisition was the crown jewel of Sterling Industries' expansion plan, worth $4 billion and 18 months of careful negotiation. Richard Hartwell was old-money Manhattan aristocracy, the kind of man who viewed business as a gentleman's game with unwritten rules. "Send them in." Richard Hartwell entered with 2 lawyers flanking him like bodyguards. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his Savile Row suit impeccable, but his usually composed demeanor showed cracks of barely controlled fury. "Alexander," he said without preamble, "we need to discuss your recent romantic entanglement." Alexander's blood chilled. "I'm not..." intelligence, dignity, and unexpected humor. He wanted to admit that somewhere between her piano performance and her quiet strength, he'd begun to fall in love with her. Instead, he heard himself say, "I think I can't afford to find out," or to... Emma nodded slowly, as if she'd expected exactly that answer. "I'll be out of your penthouse by tomorrow evening. You can announce that our engagement was a mistake, that you've come to your senses. Your precious merger will be safe." She started to walk past him toward the door, but Alexander caught her arm. "Emma, wait. I need to ask you directly. Is Hartwell right? Are you here for revenge?" Emma looked down at his hand on her arm, then back to his face. "Alexander, if I told you the truth about why I'm really here, would you believe me? Or would you assume I was lying to protect my position?" The question hung between them, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Alexander released her arm, and Emma disappeared into the penthouse, leaving him alone with the city lights and the growing certainty that he was about to make a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Later that night, as Alexander lay awake staring at the ceiling, he heard the sound of piano music drifting through the penthouse. Emma was playing something he didn't recognize, a mournful, beautiful piece that seemed to capture all the sadness of dreams dying and chances lost forever. By morning, the music had stopped, and Alexander Sterling began preparing to choose his empire over his heart. Alexander's sleep was shattered at 3 a.m. by the insistent buzzing of his phone. Margaret's name appeared on the screen, and his assistant never called at this hour unless the world was ending. "Sir," Margaret's voice was tight with urgency, "you need to see the morning news, all channels, now." Alexander stumbled to his living room and turned on the television, flipping through channels until he found the breaking news report. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. Shocking revelation about the Blackwood Industries scandal that rocked Manhattan 8 years ago, the CNN anchor was saying. New evidence has surfaced, proving that Jonathan Blackwood was indeed framed by his business partner, David Hartwell, in an elaborate scheme to hide massive embezzlement and securities fraud. Alexander's legs gave out, and he collapsed onto his sofa as the report continued. The evidence was discovered in a safety deposit box registered to David Hartwell, accessed only after his death 2 years ago by Swiss authorities investigating international money laundering. The box contained signed confessions, forged documents, and recorded conversations proving that Hartwell orchestrated the entire scheme to frame his partner when federal investigators got too close to their offshore accounts. The screen filled with documents, David Hartwell's handwriting confessing to years of embezzlement, detailed plans for framing Jonathan Blackwood, and most damning of all, recordings of Hartwell laughing about destroying that naive fool Jonathan while transferring millions to hidden accounts. Alexander's phone rang. Richard Hartwell's name appeared on the screen, but Alexander let it go to voicemail. He was too stunned to speak, too horrified by the implications of what he was seeing. The news anchor continued. Perhaps most heartbreaking is this final recording, made just days before David Hartwell's suicide, where he expresses remorse for destroying an innocent family. David Hartwell's voice, thick with guilt and alcohol, filled Alexander's living room. "Jonathan Blackwood was the most honest man I ever knew. He trusted me like a brother, and I destroyed him to save my own skin. His daughter, Emma. God, she was just a kid with dreams of being a concert pianist. What did I do to them? What did I do?" Alexander's phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret. "Sir, Richard Hartwell just issued a statement withdrawing from the merger indefinitely. He's claiming he needs time to process his family's tragic scandal. The financial press is calling it the collapse of the decade." But Alexander barely registered the business implications. All he could think about was Emma's face when he'd chosen the merger over believing in her. Emma, who had been telling the truth all along. Emma, whose family had been destroyed by the very people Alexander had chosen to trust over her. He found her in the guest suite, packing the same 2 modest suitcases she'd arrived with 3 weeks earlier. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway, and her expression was calm. Too calm, the kind of composure that came from years of practice at surviving devastating disappointment. "I suppose you've seen the news," she said quietly, folding a silk blouse with careful precision. "Emma, Alexander stopped, realizing that no words could adequately express his shame and regret. "I'm sorry, I'm so incredibly sorry." "Are you?" Emma continued packing, not looking at him. "Or are you just sorry that your business deal fell through anyway?" The question hit him like a physical blow because part of him wasn't sure of the answer. "I should have believed you. I should have trusted you over Hartwell." "Yes, you should have." Emma closed one suitcase and started on the second. "But you didn't, and that tells me everything I need to know about what I mean to you versus what your business empire means to you." Alexander stepped into the room, desperate to make her understand. "Emma, please, give me another chance. Let me prove that I can choose you over everything else." Emma's laugh was bitter. "Alexander, you had your chance to choose me. You had your chance to believe in me, to trust me, to see me as more than just a potential threat to your precious deals. And you failed. People make mistakes, Emma. People learn from their mistakes." "Some mistakes can't be undone." Emma straightened, meeting his eyes directly. "Do you know what the worst part of this is? It's not that you chose business over me. I expected that from a man like you. The worst part is that for 3 weeks I actually believed you were different. I thought maybe, just maybe, you were falling in love with me the way I was falling in love with you." The admission hung in the air between them, more devastating than any accusation. Alexander felt something crack inside his chest at the realization that he'd had something precious and rare, and he'd thrown it away for a business deal that had crumbled anyway. "You were falling in love with me?" he asked quietly. Emma's composure finally broke, tears spilling down her cheeks. "God help me, yes. Despite everything, your arrogance, your cruelty at that restaurant, your assumption that I was beneath you, I was falling in love with the man I saw in quiet moments. The man who asked thoughtful questions about my music, who listened when I talked about my dreams, who made me feel like maybe I could trust someone again." Alexander moved closer, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. "Emma, I was falling in love with you too. I am in love with you. That's why this is so hard. That's why I'm terrified of losing you. But not terrified enough to choose me when it mattered." The simple truth of it was unbearable. Alexander had spent his entire adult life making calculated decisions, weighing risks and benefits, never letting emotions cloud his judgment. But with Emma, he'd let fear override his heart when his heart was finally telling him something important. "What can I do?" he asked desperately. "How can I fix this?" Emma wiped her tears and picked up her suitcases. "You can let me go, Alexander. You can let me walk out of here with whatever dignity I have left, and you can go back to your empire building and your mergers and your safe, calculated life. I don't want that life without you in it." "Then you should have thought of that yesterday when you chose Richard Hartwell's word over mine." Emma walked toward the door, but Alexander blocked her path. "Please, just tell me what you want. Tell me how to make this right." Emma looked at him for a long moment, and Alexander saw 8 years of pain and disappointment in her green eyes. "I want you to mean it when you say you love me. I want you to choose me not because it's convenient or because your business deal fell through anyway, but because you genuinely believe I'm worth more than any deal, any merger, any amount of money. You are worth more than any of that. Prove it." "How?" Emma smiled sadly. "That's something you'll have to figure out yourself, Alexander. Grand gestures are easy when you have unlimited money. But real love, real trust, real commitment, those require something you've never been willing to give anyone." "What's that?" "Faith. Faith in another person without guarantees, without safety nets, without assurance of profit or return on investment." Emma stepped around him toward the door. "When you're ready to love someone with that kind of faith, call me. Until then, goodbye, Alexander." She was gone before he could respond, leaving only the faint scent of her perfume and the echo of devastating truth in her words. Alexander stood in the empty guest suite, surrounded by the wreckage of the best thing that had ever happened to him, and realized that for all his business acumen, he'd never learned the most important lesson of all. Some gambles were worth taking, not because you were guaranteed to win, but because losing them would cost you everything that really mattered. For the first time in his adult life, Alexander Sterling understood what it meant to feel truly poor. Outside his windows, Manhattan sparkled in the early morning light, but Alexander barely noticed. He was too busy figuring out how to prove to the woman he loved that she was worth more than his entire empire, and wondering if he was brave enough to actually do it. 2 months after Emma left, Alexander Sterling had systematically dismantled every assumption about himself that he'd built over 34 years. The revelation of David Hartwell's guilt had done more than vindicate Emma's family. It had forced Alexander to confront the uncomfortable truth that he'd inherited his father's prejudices along with his business empire. He'd spent weeks in therapy, learning to recognize the difference between calculating risks and refusing to be vulnerable. He'd restructured Sterling Industries to prioritize ethical practices over maximum profit. And most importantly, he'd begun the painstaking process of locating every person who had suffered when the Blackwood family fell, quietly making financial amends without fanfare or credit. But none of that mattered if he couldn't find Emma. She'd vanished from New York as completely as if she'd never existed. Her Queens apartment had been vacated, her former co-workers at the restaurant had no forwarding address, and even his most skilled private investigators had come up empty. Emma Blackwood had learned how to disappear from 8 years of survival in the shadows of society. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Margaret Chen knocked on his office door on a rainy Thursday evening with an expression that suggested good news for the first time in months. "Sir, I found her." Alexander's heart stopped. "Where?" "Boston. She's been working as a piano instructor at the New England Conservatory, using her maiden name and teaching under a program for underprivileged children." Margaret handed him a file. "She's also been living in a small apartment near the school and apparently playing weekend gigs at a jazz club in Cambridge." Alexander stared at the address, his hands trembling slightly. "How long has she been there?" "Since about a week after she left New York. Sir, there's something else. I made some discreet inquiries, and it appears she's been donating most of her salary to a scholarship fund for children whose families have faced financial disasters. She's calling it the Jonathan Blackwood Memorial Fund." The information hit Alexander like a physical blow. While he'd been wallowing in self-pity and business restructuring, Emma had been quietly building something beautiful from the ashes of her own tragedy. "Margaret, I need you to charter a flight to Boston tonight." "Sir, it's nearly 10 p.m. "Tonight, Margaret, and call the conservatory's dean. I want to make a donation. A large one." The New England Conservatory was a beautifully preserved building that spoke of musical traditions stretching back generations. Alexander arrived at noon the next day, his heart hammering as he followed the sound of piano music through elegantly appointed hallways. He found Emma in a small practice room, working with a boy who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. Through the glass door, Alexander watched her demonstrate a passage with the same fluid grace he remembered, her face animated with the joy of teaching. She was wearing a simple navy dress and had cut her hair shorter, just to her shoulders, but she was every bit as beautiful as his memory had insisted during the long nights without her. More beautiful, actually, because she looked genuinely happy for the first time since he'd known her. When the lesson ended and the young student left, Alexander knocked softly on the door. Emma looked up, and the blood drained from her face when she saw him. "Hello, Emma." "Alexander." She stood slowly, her hands smoothing her dress in a nervous gesture he remembered. "What are you doing here?" "Learning to take the kind of gamble that has nothing to do with business profit." Emma's eyes were guarded, but he caught a flicker of something that might have been hope. "What does that mean?" Alexander stepped into the practice room, close enough to smell her familiar perfume, but careful not to invade her space. "It means I've spent the last 2 months figuring out the difference between wanting something and deserving it. It means I've been in therapy, learning why I was so terrified of trusting you that I chose to trust Richard Hartwell instead." "And what did you learn?" "That I spent my whole life building walls to protect myself from exactly what you were offering me. Real intimacy, real trust, real love without conditions or contracts." Alexander took a shaky breath. "I learned that I was a coward who was more afraid of being vulnerable than I was committed to being worthy of you." Emma was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. "Those are important lessons, Alexander. I'm glad you learned them. But learning them doesn't automatically make everything okay between us." Alexander nodded. "I know. That's why I'm here to prove that I've changed, not just promise that I have." "How do you plan to do that?" Alexander reached into his jacket and pulled out a legal document. By doing something that goes against every business instinct I've ever had. Emma took the document, her eyes widening as she read. This is a transfer of 50% of Sterling Industries to the Jonathan Blackwood Memorial Foundation, with you as the sole trustee, empowered to direct how those profits are used. No oversight from me, no conditions, no strings attached. Alexander's voice was steady despite his racing heart. Half my empire, given freely to you to use as you see fit. Emma stared at the document, then at him. Alexander, this is hundreds of millions of dollars. It's proof that I value you more than money. It's proof that I trust you completely, without guarantee of return on investment. It's proof that I choose you over everything else, even when, especially when, I have no idea whether you'll choose me back. Emma set the document on the piano bench with trembling hands. You can't just throw money at this problem, Alexander. I'm not throwing money at the problem. I'm giving you the power to fix problems for thousands of other people, the way I should have had the power to fix your family's problems 8 years ago if I'd been paying attention to anything besides profit margins. Emma's eyes filled with tears. And what do you want in return? Nothing, Alexander said simply. If you take that money and use it to help people and never speak to me again, I'll consider it the best investment I ever made. If you take it and give me a chance to prove I can love you the way you deserve to be loved, I'll consider myself the luckiest man alive. Emma turned to look out the practice room window at the students crossing the courtyard below. You know what the hardest part of loving you was? What? Knowing that you had the capacity to be everything I needed, but watching you choose to be less than that because it felt safer. She faced him again. You broke my heart, Alexander. Not because you chose your business over me, but because you chose fear over love. I know, and I'm sorry. Not just sorry that it happened, but sorry that I was the kind of man who let it happen. Emma wiped her eyes. The man I fell in love with, the one I saw in quiet moments, would never have made the choice you made that night. Then let me prove I can be that man consistently, not just in quiet moments. Alexander stepped closer. Emma, I love you. Not because you're beautiful, or talented, or intriguing, but because you make me want to be better than I am. You make me want to deserve the kind of love you're capable of giving. And how do I know you won't get scared again when things get difficult? Alexander smiled, and Emma was startled to see that it was different from his old smiles, warmer, more genuine, less calculated. Because I'm more scared of losing you than I am of being vulnerable with you. Because I've learned that the biggest risk isn't opening my heart, it's keeping it closed and missing out on the kind of love that makes everything else meaningless. Emma stared at him for a long moment, and Alexander held his breath, waiting for her verdict. The scholarship fund, she said quietly. What about it? I want to expand it. Not just for families facing financial disaster, but for any child who shows musical promise but can't afford training. I want to create a network of programs across the country. Alexander's heart began to race. That sounds like an incredible use of resources. It would take years to build. I'd need someone I could trust completely to help manage the business side while I focused on the educational programs. I can think of someone who might be qualified for that position. Emma's smile was small but genuine. Can you? Someone with business experience but also a commitment to putting people before profits. Someone who's learned that the most important skill in business is knowing when not to be businesslike. Emma laughed, and the sound was like music to Alexander's ears. And what would this person want in return for such a commitment? The chance to wake up every morning next to the woman he loves. The opportunity to build something meaningful together instead of just building an empire. Maybe a lifetime of piano concerts in the evenings and quiet conversations over dinner. Emma stepped closer, close enough that Alexander could see gold flecks in her green eyes. That sounds like a significant long-term investment. The best investments always are. And you're prepared to make that kind of commitment, without guarantees, without certainty of success. Alexander reached up to touch her face gently. Emma Blackwood, I'm prepared to love you with the kind of faith that doesn't require guarantees. I'm prepared to choose you every day, in every situation for the rest of my life. I'm prepared to be the man you saw in me before I was brave enough to see him in myself." Emma leaned into his touch, and Alexander felt his world shift back into focus for the first time in 2 months. "Alexander Sterling, are you asking me to marry you? For real this time? I'm asking you to let me spend my life proving that some gambles are worth taking, not because you're guaranteed to win, but because losing them would cost you everything that matters." Emma's kiss was her answer, sweet and certain, and full of the promise of second chances and hard-won wisdom. When they broke apart, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time. "So," Emma said, wiping his tears with her thumb, "I suppose we have a foundation to run and a wedding to plan." "I suppose we do," Alexander agreed, "though I should warn you, I'm thinking of making this wedding significantly more elaborate than a restaurant bet." Emma's laugh was pure joy. "Well, I should warn you that I'm thinking of inviting some of my piano students to perform at the reception." "Perfect. I'll make sure to have several pianos available, just in case you decide to make any more foolish wagers." Alexander pulled her closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit in his arms. "Emma, I've already made the only wager that matters. I'm betting my heart on us, and this time I'm confident we both win." Outside the practice room windows, Boston autumn afternoon light filtered through the conservatory's historic architecture. But Alexander and Emma only had eyes for each other and the future they would build together. One built on love, trust, and the kind of faith that turns the most impossible gambles into the most beautiful victories.